We're here outside the Gothic St Mary's Church in Warwick, a town that's seen a fair share of history itself. But in particular, we're here to see the 13th Earl of Warwick, Richard Beauchamp. But who was this figure, and what medieval mysteries does this town hold? I'm Harry McNeile, and this is how it happened. In 1437, Richard commissioned this chapel, costing £2,500. That's over £2 million in today's money. That is over double what the rest of the church would have cost. The tomb itself cost £720, the exact same as a salary of a preacher if he was to preach away for over 100 years. So what makes this man so special? Richard was born in 1382 in the county of Worcestershire. He was a man of noble lineage. His godfather was Richard II of England, and his grandfather was what the French called the Warwick Devil.
Thomas Beauchamp, the 11th Earl of Warwick, a man that had proven himself as one of the English crown's most worthy assets, having fought against the Scots in the 1330s and then during the 100 Years' War against the French. Thomas Beauchamp had become one of the founders of the Order of the Garter, one of England's most prestigious knightly orders. Richard's grandfather had certainly left some pretty large boots to fill, but Richard, as the 13th Earl of Warwick, was equally up to the task of enforcing the king's authority. It appeared that Richard, like his grandfather, had found a home on the battlefield. By 1403, at just 21, Richard was present at the Battle of Shrewsbury, fighting for the Lancastrian King Henry IV against the rebel army of Henry Hotspur. The very same battle that the Prince of Wales, the future Henry V, was notoriously struck by an arrow to the side of his head. Smashing into his right cheekbone, the arrow lodged itself 6 inches into his skull. It was only with the expertise of the royal physician, John Bradmore, that the young Hal survived. It was at Shrewsbury that Richard had proven himself an able warrior, earning himself a promotion to the Knights of the Garter, following in his grandfather's footsteps. However, it was the defining conflict of the age that would propel Richard to heights of glory that he had never seen before. This conflict was the 100 Years' War. Before we explore Richard's place within this conflict, what is the context behind this war that would define Anglo-French relations for over a century?
Anglo-French relations were tumultuous to say the least, with the expulsion of English wool merchants from Flanders and a French navy wading in the English Channel. English anxieties were indeed very high. But the final straw that broke the camel's back was when, in 1337, the French Great Council decided Gascony was not English, but instead French. That camel was Edward III. With nothing but only a flimsy claim to the French throne and the full weight of an English army, Edward declared himself king of both France and England. His army landed on French soil in 1340, and the 100 Years' War would be defined by monumental victories. But where does Richard come into this story, I hear you ask?
Yeah, where was he? Where was that guy?
In 1410, Prince Henry made Richard retainer for life, in service at home and abroad. When he was king, he was concerned that his father's usurpation of the throne made him an illegitimate ruler among his lords. His decision to prove his legitimacy was war, and in particular with France. His throne would be decided by God's will, and God's will alone.
Henry V's expedition to France culminated in the infamous Battle of Azincourt in 1415. The French had mustered a group of around 15,000 men, including the majority of the French nobility, eager to get a chance to take on the English. Defeat seemed almost certain for Henry's meagre host of around 8,000 men. However, young Hal had an ace up his sleeve. Around 7,000 Welsh and English longbowmen. These men had spent years harnessing their craft in hunting and practice. Such was their efficiency that within the very first 5 minutes of the battle, 75,000 arrows were let loose. Nature, or perhaps God, appeared in the young king's favour. What had once been a lush plainland favourable for mounted cavalry had quickly turned into a muddy quagmire after the previous night's rain. It was in this muddy quagmire that the flower of the French army was drowned under a torrent of English arrows. On that day, longbowmen proved victorious against the knight.
The victory at Azincourt gave Henry all the justification he would need to assert his claim on both France and England. Yet, unlike what Shakespeare would have you believe, our protagonist Richard was not present at this battle. It was decided that Richard would be best placed in charge of sieges. But before we delve into the ones in which he was involved, what does siege warfare actually entail?
Siege warfare was a costly affair, leaving it an undertaking suited for only the most powerful. So, in an idealised sense, how would an attacker look to conduct a siege? Well, the main objective was to force a defender to surrender, or to enter the fortification by force. To do this, the besieger may deploy siege artillery like the trebuchet, which was a catapult that used a rotating arm with a sling attached to launch projectiles at the defender's walls, and possibly even cannon in the late period, or a battering ram which may be deployed, all with the hopes of breaking through a castle's defences. An attacker could also put miners to use, men that would dig beneath the castle walls' foundations in hopes of causing the section of the wall to collapse. If both these methods failed, the attackers may resort to climbing over the walls themselves, perhaps with ladders or possibly siege towers, all while the defenders threw stones, arrows and sometimes scalding liquids in hopes of stopping the attackers. However, the most frequent used option was the blockade, essentially starving out the defenders until they had no other option but to surrender. So, how would the defenders look to hold out against an attacker's onslaught? Preparation was key. For the best chance of holding out during a siege, a defender needed as much time to source as much food and water as possible, while also evacuating all non-combatants in hopes of preserving stockpiles for as long as possible. The defenders also needed missiles like arrows and stones to throw on the enemy as they attacked. Flammable liquids that could be poured onto the attackers once they had reached the walls, stones, timber and soil for the repairing of breaches to the walls, and potentially counterminers that would look to obstruct the attackers' mining efforts. So now, having briefly taken a look at medieval siege warfare, how was Richard put to use during Henry V's sieges of the castles of northern France?
Caen had been a formidable bastion in northern France. It had long been a thorn in the English side since King Hal's invasion. Richard immediately went to work, placing cannons around the perimeter of the town, meaning that by 1417, Caen had fallen. With hostages and a formidable bastion in English hands, Beauchamp's acumen for siege warfare turned towards this city of Rouen. Rouen's strategic importance cannot be understated. Not only was it the provincial capital of Normandy, but also one of the largest towns in France and home of the Royal Mint. Hoping to seize some good old French coffers, Beauchamp began where he had left off at Caen. By 1419, Rouen fell, with Richard leading negotiations with town leaders to enable the English garrisoning of the town. With the help of men like Richard Beauchamp, Henry V soundly defeated the French. Gascony remained English, while vast swathes of northern France were occupied in the name of the English crown. However, the tides of war were to turn in France's favour, because Henry V was not long for this world. It had not been since 1199, with the death of Richard Lionheart, that a king of England had died on foreign soil. In the words of the historian David Brindley, whatever the rights and the wrongs of Henry's claim to the crown of France, his decade of clear and purposeful leadership had united the country to a degree which had not been possible for half a century. Henry V was a man that prioritised loyalty. Most of the men in his inner circle had served alongside him during the Welsh campaigns. Richard was one of these men. With his physical prowess, strategic ability, and sound counsel, Henry knew he was the right advisor. Even after his death, Richard was still at the centre of power as guardian and tutor of his son, Henry VI. Richard's power and authority reached greater heights than ever before following Henry V's death. In 1423, he became captain of both Calais and Rouen, meaning he had control over the major crossing point between England and France, while also having complete authority over the English stronghold in Normandy. In 1425, he became Lieutenant General of Normandy, Anjou and Maine, meaning his power was second only to the Duke of Bedford. In 1437, Henry VI had all the powers of kingship vested within him. Richard was no longer needed as his guardian and personal tutor, which probably wasn't a bad thing, because by the 1430s, he had amassed one of Europe's largest personal empires. When he first became Earl in 1401, he was earning annually £1,400, but by 1430, he was earning £5,500 pounds. That's a lot more money.
Richard's vast fortune was put to good use. St. Mary's Church was cared for, and as we have seen, vast sums of money were put towards his personal chapel. A medieval masterpiece that, fortunately for us, has stood the test of time. From the gorgeous stained glass windows, Richard's ornate effigy, to the beautifully designed ceiling, Richard's chapel is a remarkable piece of medieval history. Warwick Castle itself was also fundamentally changed by Richard. Under his ancestors, the castle had been a mere Spartan fortification, but under Richard, it had enjoyed the extensions of staterooms and private apartments, and the whole south side of the castle was rebuilt. However, by the 1430s, Richard's story was coming to a close.
By the 1430s, the tides of war were beginning to turn in France's favour. In 1437, Richard was made once again Lieutenant of France. He was 55, at a time where being in your 50s meant near death.
Initially, Richard attempted to decline Henry VI's request, writing to the king, "My going over at this time is full far from the ease of my years and from the continual labour of my person at sieges and daily occupation in the war, seeing the length of time that I've belaboured in the services of noble kings of good memory, your grandsire and father, and about yourself, as well as in your war as about your noble person." Despite Richard's attempts to decline his position in France, the young King Henry was adamant that Richard should return to his service.
As lieutenant, Richard found his task challenging. Rouen had not been repaired since the previous English sieges, and French attacks in the surrounding towns appeared relentless. It was clear that France, now with the upper hand, was looking for a decisive victory. It appears the task was too great for the aged Earl, and on the 30th of April, 1339, Richard died at Rouen Castle, aged 57. Like Richard, St. Mary's is indeed remarkable, a testament that the man was more than just his knightly exploits. Now let me leave you to take in this treasure of the medieval world. I'm Harry McNeile, and that's how it happened.